Back when I was in high school and college, we used to have a term that we used called that guy. Now, oftentimes we would hit dudes with the that guy label when they were trying to present themselves as something that they're not. For example, when I was in high school and college, we used to frequent nightclubs. Now, today at 38 years old, I would never step foot inside a nightclub. It's no longer my scene. But when I was a teenager, when I was in my early 20s, the nightclub scene, I thought it was appealing. We would hit the clubs every night from Wednesday to Saturday. It never failed. No matter what nightclub that we were in, there was always that guy in the club. That guy who was 35 years old pretending like he was 21 trying to pick up college girls. Or that guy who couldn't afford a bus pass bragging to anyone who would listen about how much money he's got. That guy who was the pretend tough guy who talked a good game until it was time to throw hands. When that time came, the only thing that he was throwing was a girl in front of him to defend him. It has been probably about 15 years since I have labeled someone with a that guy label, but today I'm going to restore that tradition. You guys know how Bomani Jones is the inspiration for the term huge embarrassing failure? Mark Jones is now the inspiration for the restoration of the term that guy. Who? Mark Jones! Mark Jones! There's just no other way to say it, and I don't use this word often when I describe people, but there's just no other way to describe Mark Jones. That guy is a loser. You see, Mark Jones, he is the worst type of shit fuck because Mark Jones is a complete fraud. Some of my longtime viewers, you guys will probably remember fake Bishop the Talbot Swan. I try not to mention him too much anymore because I don't want to give free publicity to his hatred. Now, for those that don't know, the Talbot Swan, he is a professional victim. He believes the white man is the reason that he's a huge embarrassing failure. Back in June, he claimed that whiteness was an unrelenting demonic force of evil. Believe it or not, I have more respect for the Swan than I do for Mark Jones. I might find the Swan detestable. I think he capitalizes on mythical racism, but one thing I will give him credit for, at least the Swan is honest. He thinks white people are evil. He's not afraid to say it. I'm okay with that. Me personally, I think the Swan is a flea-infested shitbird, but at least we both know where we stand. I can't say the same for Mark Jones. Mark Jones is an actor. He's a pretender. He pretends to be the victim of mythical racism. He pretends to come from humble beginnings. I'm from the hood, G. I know hard times. I'm Mike Jones. Who Mike Jones? In public, Mark Jones pretends to have a real problem with the white man. On many occasions, he is like the propaganda tweeted by the Swan. Mark Jones pretends to be a general in the woke army leading the fight against mythical racism. But the truth is, the story of Mark Jones is living proof, the real Mark Jones. His story is living proof that racism does not exist in most normal people in America. Now, that does not mean I'm saying racism doesn't exist. I'm saying for most normal people, race is not a factor. If you were to believe the public persona of Mark Jones, someone who pretends to be all about black power, you would think he practiced what he preached. You'd think he had a black agent, lived in a black neighborhood, married a black woman, created black children. You would think he sent his children to inner city schools to be around kids that they could relate to. Of course, none of that is true. Mark Jones has a white agent. He's married to a white woman, and he sends his kids to a private school which consists mostly of white children. You see, Mark Jones pretends to struggle. He pretends to be a victim. Throughout his career, Mark Jones has been overcompensating because he was accused of not being black enough, which, to be completely fair to Mark Jones, I have never understood this in the black community. I have never understood why some people in their community want to criticize others for their success. But either way, that criticism is what caused Mark Jones to overcompensate. Translation? The criticism turned Mark Jones into that guy, pretending to be something that he's not. What did this life of pretend do for Mark Jones? Last spring, It landed him a multi-year extension with the worldwide leader in woke, ESPN. When ESPN announced this deal last year, I was incredibly confused. For one, Mark Jones is the worst broadcaster at the network. That is not hyperbole. That is not conjecture. That is fact. Mark Jones has been at ESPN since 1990, 33 years. That is 33 years of experience broadcasting live sporting events. Have you ever wondered why ESPN doesn't have Mark Jones calling NFL games? He fucking sucks. College football, Mark Jones, worst broadcaster. NBA, where ESPN's coverage is the worst in the business, Mark Jones, the worst of the worst. I was also confused by this extension because Mark Jones, he is barely used by ESPN outside of broadcasting live games. Kirk Herbstreit, for example, he's on College Game Day. He calls the marquee game every week, calls the playoffs, national championship. During football season, Kirk Herbstreit's on SportsCenter. Hell, he's all over ESPN. Stephen A. Smith, used everywhere. Same with Mike Greenberg or someone like Mina Kimes. But when it comes to Mark Jones, ESPN's got him hidden in the basement. He used to share a mattress in the woke dungeon along with his emotional support goat. ESPN hides him on college football games that no one cares about, no one's watching. It's almost like ESPN is embarrassed of Mark Jones. This dude provides no value. He's completely useless. Now, with that being the case, why would ESPN extend his contract? The answer's quite simple. ESPN knew if they fired Mark Jones, he would pull the race card. He would call up the Swan, offering him a spot in the Butt Bongo band in exchange for his services of charging ESPN with mythical racism. But KC, why wasn't he included in the layoffs this year? ESPN could justify the firing of Mark Jones by claiming they don't have the resources to pay him. Oh, my naive common sense thinker. ESPN couldn't justify laying him off. You see, Mark Jones is the only play-by-play broadcaster at ESPN who calls NBA games. Here we go again with another media company basing their personnel decisions on diversity. Let me ask you something. When you're watching the NBA or the NFL, Major League Baseball, pick your league. When you're watching, how many times do you question the race of the broadcaster? We just talked about the flaws of diversity this morning with CNN. This is always a lose-lose. When you hire an unqualified candidate based solely on the fact that they match one of the crayons in the woke coloring book, you set yourself up for failure. Obviously, with the person being unqualified, they don't have the skills to adequately do the job. Prime example of that, Mark Jones. Does anyone think Mark Jones is a good broadcaster? When the inevitable happens and you're forced to fire the unqualified candidate, you are automatically charged with mythical racism. With ESPN terrified of being labeled a fake racist, they put themselves in a position where they could not fire Mark Jones. Instead, they give him a substantial raise to be completely useless. Instead of firing him and saving all that money and possibly saving the job of someone like Susie Colbert, who actually has a skill set, ESPN decided to reassign Mark Jones. Translation, for the second time in 3 months, Mark Jones got demoted. He was demoted back in May from calling the NBA conference finals on ESPN radio. Do you know how bad you've got to suck at your job to get demoted on ESPN radio? They have a hard time finding people willing to host shows on that dump. Somehow, Mark Jones found a way to get demoted. And now, he is being demoted from calling NBA games. I guess ESPN finally said diversity be damned. Mark Jones has been removed from the B team, the broadcast team responsible for calling the marquee games on ESPN. He now finds himself on the D team with Hubie Brown. In other words, Mark Jones will barely be calling NBA games this season. And the person I really feel for here is Hubie Brown. Hubie Brown is an absolute legend. This dude's been calling NBA games for like 50 years. And to end his broadcasting career, ESPN decides to pair him with Mark Jones, the worst broadcaster in the history of the business? If I were Hubie Brown, I would retire. ESPN's doing the exact same thing with Mark Jones that they did with Bomani Jones. I guess you could say ESPN is giving him the Jones treatment. They are lowering his profile. They are taking away his opportunities and hoping that we will forget about him. Because make no mistake about it, Mark Jones is an embarrassment to ESPN. According to Outkick, executives at ESPN, they are sick of his bullshit, but they're still afraid to fire him. Let me list some of the recent highlights in the career of Mark Jones. Now, while I'm going through this list, ask yourself, if someone like JJ Redick did this same shit, if JJ Redick would still be working at ESPN. Mark Jones, he shared a tweet of someone calling Stephen A. Smith a coon. During an NBA broadcast, he purposely lied about police killing Jacob Blake when Jacob Blake was actually alive. He also lied and said that police shot Jacob Blake when he was unarmed, even though Jacob Blake publicly admitted he was armed with a knife. He called Batman a racist. Now, my inside sources tell me he was given that piece of propaganda from the Star Trek virgin Mike Freeman. Mike Freeman hates any superhero not named Captain Kirk. He called Abraham Lincoln a racist. Yeah. The guy who freed the slaves is somehow racist. He claimed to be afraid of police escorts. He claimed he lived in fear that cops escorting him in and out of stadiums would mistake him for a criminal. Now, that is just a small portion of his highlights. I could sit here for another 10, 15, 20 minutes going over the bullshit of Mark Jones. Again, if JJ Redick did the same thing, would he still be working at ESPN? What about Tim Tebow? Now, to be honest with you, ESPN doesn't even need these justifications for firing Mark Jones. This dude should be fired because he sucks at his job, he provides no value, and hopefully, that is the direction that ESPN is heading. Like I said, they did the same thing with Bomani Jones. They softened the blow. It was a slow, gradual process. It took ESPN years to build up the courage to fire Bomani Jones. And as bad as the Bobo was, he was nowhere near as bad as Mark Jones. At least Bomani Jones was eloquent when he was describing cases of mythical racism. Mark Jones, he can barely put a sentence together. When it comes to anything cerebral, Mark Jones, he's like a boxer with no arms. He's defenseless. This dude has no business calling NBA games or college football games for that matter, but you give me your thoughts. ESPN demotes Mark Jones again. Now, while I'm fine with the demotion, I still think Mark Jones should be fired, not because he pretends to fight mythical racism. ESPN should let him go because he doesn't serve a purpose. He adds no value. But what do you think? Sound off in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe. Click the notification bell to receive all notifications from the channel. Best way to contact me is by email at btlkc84@gmail.com, KC_BTL84 on Twitter. I'll see you guys tomorrow.